Welcome to another episode of Grace on Tap. Grace on Tap is a podcast dedicated to the history and the theology of the Lutheran Reformation, all over a nice cold beer.
I'm Evan Gaertner.
And I'm Mike Yagley.
This is episode 4, as we are looking at a biography of Frederick the Wise. So we finished with this kind of call for what was being described as a crusade, but a lot of the German princes didn't really see it as a religious crusade as much as power protection for Italy and Charles V's kind of empire that's not Germany.
So, one of the big things that was happening there, Luther had just posted the 95 Theses. The Pope was out to get him. And so that Frederick the Wise was called into a Reichstag, that this was going to be one of the issues that was going to be discussed at this Reichstag. And it was this was probably one of the more dicey periods for Frederick the Wise, where he had to navigate through this Reichstag and not give up Luther. And the Pope sort of gave him an out without meaning to. The Pope and the Emperor tried to get everybody to go to war with the Turks, and nobody wanted to go to the war with the Turks. And so what sort of happened was, once they said no, once all the princes said no about going to war with the Turks, it made it pretty easy to say no about Luther. The Pope sort of overplayed his hand.
So this Reichstag in Augsburg has some theological implications, but a lot of those theological implications about is Luther right or wrong is also wrapped up into kind of some political maneuvering to try to get people to go to war.
Right. This period actually is the question of whether Luther was right or wrong was actually not part of the discussion. In this particular period, Luther was still,
It's 1518.
This is 1518. Up until about 1520, Luther was still pretty firmly a Catholic.
He's inside the Augustinian order. There's still a lot of space for this conversation to happen. Kind of the big tent is still existing.
Right. And also Luther still carried a lot of Catholic. As a matter of fact, I would say, if you look at Catholic theology today, a lot of the things in Catholic theology today after Vatican II, it's pretty close to Luther's beliefs in this period. That a lot of the things are sort of aligned. They've gotten rid of the abuse of the indulgences. They've gotten rid all the things Luther was talking about in 1518 are now the modern Catholic Church.
And this kind of folding of time periods for Luther, I even did it at the beginning because I started talking about Emperor Charles V and his territories down below Germany. But there's not an Emperor Charles V yet.
No, this is still Maximilian.
This is still Maximilian. So the Emperor and the Pope are trying to build alignment around this proposed crusade. The Emperor and the Pope wanted to have all of Europe to join with them in fighting against the Turks. The Turks, today we would say, Muslim armies coming up from Turkey towards the Danube. They're approaching Vienna. And so it's interesting for me to think about how they call them the Turks. And they're not calling them like this Muslim horde or this great army of religious. There's these moments when it gets described with religious terms. And there's other times when it sounds like it's just one geographical area against another geographical area.
And that's probably more accurate, actually. The fact that they call them the Turks is sort of a tell that this is more about power than religion. And that was the complaint that Frederick the Wise had and the rest of the princes had, was you want us to go to war with these guys not because of religion. Religion is a fig leaf for all the power plays that are going on in this time, and both by Emperor Maximilian, and also by the Pope. And so you have this sort of recognition, and the fact that they all call it the Turks in this period is sort of a tell that that's what's going on here. They don't reference the religion, they reference the land.
So this Reichstag in Augsburg, maybe on the table, maybe on the agenda is Luther, but Luther and his 95 Theses are kind of pushed off the table because this conversation about the crusade really is forefront. And so although Maximilian was willing to hand over Luther, this crusade has irritated the princes of Europe enough that they've pushed the whole Luther question off the table. And so 1518 doesn't become this great moment of Reformation history that 1517 or 1521 are going to be.
1518, this period of 1518 to about 1520 is a period of the real tension is going to be on Frederick to navigate through all the different ways that the Pope tries to get Luther. And don't forget, the Pope isn't coming after even here, the Pope has never really made a theological argument for coming after Luther, except insubordination. It's the Pope is saying, you're being insubordinate, I'm going to kill you. And as we get through this, we'll start to see that, the princes are looking at this and saying, we sort of like this Luther guy.
We like to have someone who stands up with a separate voice.
Right. And even the princes who ultimately became firm Catholics and went to war for the Pope down the road, in this period, they're looking at it and they're saying, the Pope does abuse his power, and we sort of like the things Luther is saying because it will clip the Pope's wings a little bit. And that's so even like Prince George is friendly to Luther during this period. Prince George is Frederick's cousin, I think, yes, who really hated Luther eventually. But during this period, he's sort of like, he's got a point. And so Frederick is maneuvering in a way that he's leveraging his allies, but at the same time, he recognizes that the Pope can get the emperor's support, like he did it's actually at this Reichstag, the emperor and the Pope sort of aligned, and it was only because the princes stood up that it all sort of fell apart.
So now we have Maximilian starting to get aligned with the Pope, but there's a push-pull back towards the princes. And this is where Frederick the Wise and his ability to be an elector, his office, his vocation at the Reichstag is as an elector. He's one of the people that's going to be involved in electing the next Holy Roman Emperor. Maximilian is aging, and he's starting to line up the next Holy Roman Emperor. And he knows, as much as he needs the Pope as a part of religion and all of that, he needs the princes, and specifically he needs Frederick the Wise. Because if he wants his grandson Charles to get elected, he cannot spend all of his time at this Reichstag in opposition to Frederick the Wise.
Right. And it really is. Coming into 1518, we went through the whole history of the whole history of Frederick the Wise up until the 95 Theses. We spent several episodes on that. And you really see the providence here, because not only was Frederick one of the few faithful princes, he was also one of the he was probably the most powerful prince. And so you had a prince here who was the most powerful prince in all of the empire, who was faithful enough that he very much wanted the church to be reformed. And he wanted to get the money and all the greed out of the church as much as possible.
So Frederick is noble just as like nobility, but he's also noble in character, is that he does seek the reform of the church for the strength of the church.
Correct. Yeah.
He has the ability to possibly become the next Holy Roman Emperor. He could rally and caucus the other electors against Maximilian's choice. There is a route, there is a path for Frederick the Wise to become the next Holy Roman Emperor. But in conciliation with Maximilian, he ends up supporting Maximilian's choice of Charles. And in doing that, some more nobility is shown about Frederick the Wise. Rather than causing division among all the electors and kind of throwing a wrench into Maximilian's plans by insisting that he becomes the next elector, he steps back. Why do you think he steps back?
And that's going to be in today's episode. We're going to be talking about the death of today's episode is in 1580, just right after this Reichstag. Leaving the Reichstag, we'll talk about that, and you have Maximilian on his way back home, and he gets sick and he dies. Yeah. And 1518 is thrown into who's going to be the next emperor. And we'll be talking about this this election of Charles and the role Frederick ends up playing in this election. So that's a good segue into what's coming. So let's take a step back and just sort of bring everybody up to speed. We've talked a little bit about it already. Luther in 1517. It was October of 1517. Luther posts the 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. Frederick the Wise recognizes that he needs to keep Luther out of Rome in order to keep him alive. But you can't, the Pope is
out of Rome physically and out of Rome's jurisdiction as well.
Yes. And so Frederick begins. Frederick recognizes Maximilian as his best friend, and Frederick is their best buds. But Frederick also recognizes that Maximilian is not somebody Emperor Maximilian is not somebody you can trust as far as you can throw him. He will stab you in the back in a heartbeat just to get what he wants. He's very Machiavellian. And
the prince that knows how to serve his own purposes and keep his own power. That's
Maximilian. And so Frederick he's playing with the emperor this sort of, it's sort of like a cat and mouse game. Just, the emperor will say, "Oh yeah, I'm all for Luther," but Frederick doesn't really believe him. So there's this period here that they come into this Reichstag, and Frederick actually works his way through this Reichstag and gets everything he wanted out of it. He saved Luther. They ended up not going to war with the Turks. This Reichstag and the emperor got nothing. So Frederick got everything he wanted. The Pope got nothing, and the emperor got nothing. The Pope got nothing. Frederick came out the winner and out of this Reichstag.
And he makes sure that Luther's not going to be extradited to Rome. And so now the Pope has let Maximilian down. It feels like the emperor realized he needed his old friend Frederick more than ever if he wanted to get his grandson Charles elected. So let's talk a little bit about some of the movements between Maximilian and Charles. Maximilian as king and Maximilian as emperor is part of the story that's involved in these. These feel like just titles, but they become obstacles that Frederick utilizes, referencing this thing called this golden bull.
Yeah. So the trick that Maximilian's father used to get Maximilian to be the emperor was he had Maximilian crowned as king first while his father was still alive. I forget what his father's name was. But he had Maximilian crowned as king first. And then it was a foregone conclusion that once the emperor died, Maximilian became the emperor. It was, you had the king of the empire became the emperor of the empire, and there was really no discussion about it. So Maximilian wanted to do the same thing with Charles and crown him king. Frederick was the one who saw how this was going to play out, and Frederick said, "No, we're not going to elect Charles as king and lose all our negotiating power as we go in when you die, Maximilian. Someday you're going to die, and we want to have negotiating power in those discussions." And so he frustrated Maximilian at that, and so Maximilian is trying to negotiate around Frederick in all of this. And then so Frederick, and the way Frederick did it was really interesting, because what he said was, he goes, "Hey, listen, I would love to make Charles the king, but guess what? You never became the emperor, because
so you're still the king.
You're still the king. The Pope never crowned you the emperor, and so we can't have two kings And you have to become the official emperor first. And so Maximilian got all excited thinking that he could work with the Pope. And the Pope said, what do I get out of this? And Maximilian was frustrated.
And so then the Pope suddenly realizes he has some leverage because Maximilian needs the Pope to crown him as emperor.
Right.
Because he wants Charles to be crowned king. But the Pope refused, saying Maximilian would need to travel to Rome to be crowned.
Right.
Maximilian was furious.
Right.
He suspected that if he did travel to Rome, the Pope still may not crown him emperor. There would be, give a mouse a cookie, one more thing, one more thing, one more thing.
Because the Pope was just like Maximilian. I mean, these were two birds of a feather. You know, they both would make promises, pull back on those promises. They were both very Machiavellian. They both sort of...
He shouldn't have to give up anything to be crowned emperor because he's already the emperor, but he's expecting the Pope is going to ask for some political chips.
He's expecting the Pope to ask a lot. And what he was worried about was if he went to Rome, now he's in Rome, and he's done all this. Made this big journey. It was a big deal to go to Rome. He goes to Rome, and then the Pope says, "Oh, I'm sorry, you know, you didn't bring the right piece of paper. I'm sorry, I can't do it." You know, or something would come up, and
so the Pope doesn't become the leverage that helps Maximilian,
right?
And so now Maximilian even more needs Frederick.
And this gives you a clue to how small a piece of the, you know, this whole Luther thing,
if in a bigger context.
And it's the Luther problem was not seen as huge just yet, because if Luther was a huge chit, you know, something that could be traded, if that was a big deal, a really big deal, then Maximilian could have offered him up. Hey, I'll give you Luther. You make me emperor. We're good. But Maximilian didn't look at Luther and say, you know, that's going to be enough for the Pope. He assumed that just giving up Luther wouldn't be a big deal, big enough to become emperor, and that the Pope would ask for more.
But he does know that with Frederick the Wise, Luther means something.
Exactly.
And so his first step, Maximilian's step, to ingratiate Frederick into kind of Maximilian's camp and supporting Maximilian's grandson as the next Holy Roman Emperor, is to say to Frederick, here's what we're going to do with Luther. We're not going to let him be examined by Rome. He's going to be examined within the empire. And this was one of Frederick's truths. He thought Luther will be safe as long as he's not placed into the jurisdiction of Rome.
That's right.
And this isn't partly just a theological thing, but it's stating kind of a German nationalism that is building a little bit, that Frederick, and he rallies the other princes around this, is the idea that to defend a German on German soil, we're not going to extradite Luther to a foreign power to be judged by a foreign power.
And this is also, going back to what we talked about earlier, you have the princes looking at this. Luther hasn't said anything really radical yet. This is just a simple, true reformation of the worst abuses of the church that Luther is asking for. Many very faithful people are on board with Luther, and even the ones who are not faithful are on board with Luther because it cuts the power of the Pope a little bit. And so you have a lot of support, and I think we never find out because it never happened. But if Luther was tried in Germany or anywhere outside of Rome, he most likely, or very likely, my read of what I've pulled out, my read of the situation is that he most likely would have gotten the upper hand against the Pope.
So he doesn't quite get tried in Germany by a German power, but he does stay in Germany. But on September 11th, the Pope sent an order to Cardinal Cajetan to examine Luther in Augsburg, so in Germany. The changing political landscape can be seen in the different attitude of the Pope. The Pope is asking Cajetan to examine Luther, and he said, do it carefully, but not contentiously. This is due to Frederick's strong opposition with the empire after that Reichstag. Frederick's got a promise from Cajetan that Luther would be dealt with benevolently, mildly, and Frederick even got a promise that Luther would get released after this questioning. Maybe you could call the questioning an interrogation.
Yeah, I think they called it an interview or something. But yeah.
This reminds me of someone who's brought into an interrogation room. You got the double-sided mirror, and they're like, "Am I free to go?" And they're like, "Well, you could go, but if you go, then we're a lot more suspicious. So why don't you stay and answer our questions?"
It was along those lines, and Luther, being Luther, he shows up at this, and he's not going to be wowed by Cajetan's position. He was very nervous walking in the door. I think they show that in the movie, where he's very nervous. But then he sort of gets his
he gets his feet under him again. He realizes that Cajetan is kind of authoritarian, and Luther's confidence in his stubbornness is based on his reading of the word and not just his reading of power.
Right. And so Luther comes back with, yeah, I'm if you show me, and Cajetan, all Cajetan has is, I am your superior. You better do what I say. And Luther, it's like, no, I can't. You have to show me with the word of Scripture. And so you have this, Cajetan is very furious.
Cajetan's not there for a debate. He's there to clearly, here are the church's concerns, now recant. While Luther is seeing this as an opportunity to engage in some theological academic debate, but that's not going to happen. So let's talk about the first concern. There's a bull. Bulls are not animals in this case. They're statements by a pope that give a declaration of opinion on things. And in 1343, there was a bull that gave the church exclusive control over the treasury of merit.
So we probably should talk a little bit about what the treasury of merit is.
So Mike is awesome, and Mike does more than he needs. So he has made deposits into the treasury of merit, and because Mike's a part of the church, he's made these deposits with the church. And then the church gets to distribute these treasuries of merits to other people who may not be quite as awesome as Mike.
It's sort of, for Lutherans, it's difficult to wrap your head around the treasury of merit, because in Lutheran theology, we everything that we do and everything we fail to do is a sin. And so if there's an opportunity to do good and we don't do that good, that's a sin. Well, at least in this era in Catholic theology,
scholastic theology is a lot of scorekeeping.
And if you miss an opportunity to do something good, well, that's not a sin. The sin are the evil things that you do. So if you miss doing something, well, that's not a sin. That's just like, if you follow all the rules and don't do anything bad, and then you do good things on top of that, well, that's a plus.
Yeah.
Now that's something in the plus column.
And if you've got more pluses than you need,
yeah, if you need to be at 0 to get into heaven, right? And so you did all this extra stuff. What happens to all that extra stuff?
Deposited into the treasury of merit.
It goes into the deposit.
So Cajetan says that the church gets to distribute from the treasury of merit to whomever it wills and desires. This is the purposes of the indulgences. They're distributed from the treasury of merit to those who are faithful or doing acts of obedience. And what is Luther's opinion about the treasury of merit? If the church has these good works that are deposited, then they should be freely distributed. They shouldn't be controlled.
It was funny. Pope Francis, actually, I think last year or 2 years ago or something, he opened up the treasury of merit and said, I'm giving it all away. As much as anybody wants, it's free. You show up to...
There were still some works, like they had it with the Youth Day down in Brazil, that if you're there, you get some. If you remember them, you get some. If you pray for them, you get some. It was still tied to some acts of obedience.
There was some time, but he was extremely generous with the treasury of merit. And so again, this is sort of getting to what I was saying earlier. Post-Vatican II Catholicism is very, very close to Lutheran theology of 1518. Very close. And so you look at what the Catholic Church is doing, and
there's some encouragement.
It's very close. It's amazing.
This is the first day then. Cardinal Cajetan's got 2 points. The Bull of 1343, Luther, I want you to accept that the church has the power to release and retain sins, and which is a little bit of scripture, but Cajetan doesn't make it just about the office of the keys. He makes it that we get to distribute extra to whoever we want. And the second thing is he wanted Luther to recant that Christians received justification when they received the sacraments.
So, and that's sort of like saying, that you don't have to repent. It's where it's purely an action, where it's like this idea of communion as being just magic.
That's not what Luther was advocating.
Luther's against that.
Luther is saying that the benefits of the sacrament are received through faith.
Right.
And Cajetan wants to kind of excise this conversation of faith away from it and make it more of a process. You go to it, you get to it.
That's right. So you have the medieval Catholic Church coming up against the beginnings of Lutheran theology.
Justification by grace.
Where faith is a huge part of it. And this is it's an amazing argument. I've heard some theologians talk about this period and say, gee, if Luther really understood Catholic theology during this period, we wouldn't have had a split.
But if Catholics really understood Catholic theology at this time, they would have known the need for Luther's words.
Exactly.
And this sometimes is the two trains crossing moment. Are they really saying the same thing, but just in different words, or is there really a conflict? And what we'll start to see is that Cajetan doesn't want to debate the theology. He wants to debate the power. Luther accept that the Pope has this power and move on. And Luther's like, no, I'm going to accept that the power is in Scripture. And that's why in the first day, he couldn't accept any of Cardinal Cajetan's argument, because he said, you're making arguments about canon law. I'm trying to make arguments about Scripture.
That's right. And so you have this era, and it is sort of two trains, because one's more interested in power and the other one's more interested in theology. Even what Cajetan, who is a great theologian, he's studied today in Catholic circles. He's one of the great theologians of all time. Even he comes into this and is more interested in maintaining the power of. He's not interested in the theology. He's interested in just maintaining the power of the Catholic Church during this era.
We could, jump ahead when the 404 articles are written by Eck, and these become a part of the Bull of Excommunication for Luther. And a couple years later, Luther was so frustrated arguing with John Eck, because the conversation had none of the same academic quality that he had when he talked to Cardinal Cajetan.
Yeah.
The second day, Luther appeared now with Staupitz, who requested that Luther be allowed to respond to the answer of the disputed points in writing. So this is kind of a common point where you have oral back and forth. It's possible for Cardinal Cajetan to leave the room and say, Luther said these, and kind of make up the argument. And Staupitz is recognizing that this conversation is taking on some legal quality to it. So it's time to get some stuff down on paper.
There's several things happening here, I think. The first one is what you said, but there's also this idea that Staupitz wants to slow down the discussion, which is a tactical sort of thing where he doesn't want this thing
turn the heat down a little bit.
Turn the heat down. Let's sort of start doing things more slowly. But then there's also this. They're talking about two different things. And I think Staupitz recognizes that.
The power and the theology.
Yeah, the power and the theology.
So the second day is all about negotiating how the answers are going to happen. Are we going to stay in kind of this oral conversation between Cajetan and Luther back and forth, or is it going to get down on paper? Finally, at the end of the second day, Cardinal Cajetan says, yes, I accept that we can do it on paper with some written answers. So now we get to the third day. And putting it on paper, did it make it better? No, things started to deteriorate on the third day when Luther brought his written answers.
So the critical thing is this papal bull of 1343, where the church took unto itself the power of the treasury of merit, which is the foundation for indulgences and all these abuses that came out of indulgences.
So rather than forgiveness being based on faith, forgiveness was based on the ability to negotiate with the church for a release from the treasury of merit.
Right.
Faith is not a part of the conversation. Acts of obedience, going up these certain stairs on these knees in this certain way, or saying these certain amount of prayers in this certain way. Faith is not a part of the treasury of merit in 1343 and onward.
That's true.
And Luther's trying to say faith needs to be a part of this conversation.
Right. And so you end up with this sort of situation where Luther comes out very clearly and says, hey, listen, you guys have had one council after another that has been where you have a council and then the later council rejects the teachings of the previous council. You can't say that just because in 1343 the council said that there's this treasury of merit thing and all this, you can't say that that's actually, God doesn't change. Okay, God's truth doesn't change, but you guys change these councils around however you see fit. So obviously the councils, even the councils, which is the highest authority within the Catholic Church, even the councils drop the ball. They still are tainted with sinfulness.
So ad fontes is kind of this conversation of humanism. Erasmus is going to get to this later. Go back to the sources. Ad fontes, go back to the font. Go back to the spring from which everything is springing from. And let's see what that says. And this is where Luther says, we got to go back to Romans chapter 1, verse 17, that I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of salvation for all who believe.
Right. And so you have this, this is a really remarkable period here, this discussion with Cajetan. It is one of the great moments in Christian history where you have two of the great thinkers of this era, greatest thinkers of this era, getting together and talking this out. And it's from a Catholic perspective, the Catholics are like, how did we miss that opportunity?
Yeah.
The modern Catholics will look at it and say, I have friends who are Catholic priests, and they go. One friend of mine went to the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and they're walking through. And they're looking at the beautiful St. Peter. And of course, the indulgences in this period are there to pay for St. Peter's Basilica. And him and his priest friends are all talking about, was it really worth it? Was it really worth it? This is a beautiful building, but it wasn't worth it.
So this is a moment in Reformation history where the accusation is Lutherans start a new church. And Lutherans will say, we didn't start the church. We were bringing continuity back to the church.
Exactly.
Back to what the scripture said. It's the medieval scholastic theology that had left the church.
Yeah.
And this kind of going back and forth, when you look at the family trees of churches, Lutherans like to place themselves in kind of a solid rooted line back to the beginning.
Back to Paul, at least.
No one wants to be the sectarian. No one wants to be the one that says, I'm the divided group. You guys were right and I left you. But this is part of why Lutherans will say, ad fontes, going back to the source, we find continuity with the scriptures for what we are arguing. You only find continuity back to 1343.
Right. And so I think it's time for a beer break.
Let's just try to get to the end of the meeting.
Good.
Because so they don't meet for a few more days. Cajetan tries to get ways to Luther to recant. There's rumors that maybe he would break his promise to Frederick. He would jail Luther. And during this time, Luther and his lawyers are waiting for this next shoe to drop. And they write a formal appeal that the Pope was not yet well enough informed to act against Luther. That no matter what happens with Cajetan, there's not enough information from this interview to truly make any decision on Luther. After 5 days, they've been at Augsburg. They've been talking back and forth. But after 5 days, Luther's had enough. He leaves a letter. Dear John, it's not you, it's me. But he left a letter to Cajetan stating that he had fulfilled all of his responsibilities. He was patient. He listened to all of Cajetan's argument. He made his own arguments. Everything's on paper. We know where everybody stands, and I'm leaving.
And he snuck out
Through a crack in the wall because the gates were locked.
I'm not surprised the gates were locked, by the way.
Yeah, the gates were locked on purpose, but he found a way out. And in all of this, Cajetan, he agrees that Luther had found a massive hole. Not the massive hole in the wall, that was just a crack. But Luther had found a massive hole in the Roman Catholic positions on indulgences. That what is an indulgence hadn't been clearly identified. And Cajetan followed up this meeting with Luther with a letter to the Pope offering a definition of what indulgences are, The Pope quickly delivers a decree making Cajetan's definition now the official position of the Roman Catholic Church. And so now this meeting in Augsburg in the fall of 1518 has left with Luther feeling like he's been able to stand on the argument that salvation is by Christ, and we hold on to that salvation through faith. And Cajetan's tried to argue that the church continues to have the office of the keys. And for Cajetan, this is what he sees. He sees it's the character of the church to release and unrelease. And Luther wouldn't disagree on the office of the keys. He'll write about that in a small catechism 10 years from now. But for Luther, the loosing and unloosing of heaven is always based on Christ, not by some canon law.
Not by the bull of 1343, certainly.
Certainly. Okay, so now this beer break that Mike has been waiting for. We got to tell you, we're trying something different for us. We've reviewed one other non-alcoholic drink. This is Guinness Zero.
So yeah, Guinness is, first of all, non-alcoholic drinks are the fastest growing segment in beer sales today. And so Guinness is getting on the Guinness of all people. I'm sort of surprised. I was sort of surprised to see that Guinness put out a non-alcoholic beer, so I had to try it.
And so non-alcoholic beers are really developing into a market, not just for the designated driver at a bar so he can look like he's having fun, but really he's just waiting for his friends to be done at the bar.
He's not having fun.
That's no longer the marketing for non-alcoholic drinks. I really feel like for a stretch, that was really what non-alcoholic drinks were marketed.
Originally,
is,
yeah.
The theater of looking like you're having fun, but we know you're not.
Yeah,
but this will give you something to hold in your hand.
Right. The non-alcoholic beers of that era were terrible. They were actually absolutely terrible. Now, this new era of the new non-alcoholic beers are much, much better.
And I feel like Guinness and Heineken are the two brands that I see marketing most into this space.
But supposedly, I've been trying, I think it's called Athletic.
Yeah, we reviewed one of their beers a couple months ago.
That was pretty good.
That was, yeah.
And
getting the crispness of that that Pilsner was there. This one is a
stout.
A stout.
Course. It's again a stout.
In the next episode, we'll also review a stout.
A real stout.
A real stout. Creamy, roasted malts. This one is less than 0.5% alcohol by volume. It tastes like Guinness. It's got, I think, just a little bit less of something.
It's less full.
Yeah.
It doesn't have as much body to it. It is more watery, I think, but it
really has the roasted malt flavor. Still, the chocolate coffee hues are there.
It still has a lot of the flavor of a Guinness, which is sort of surprising. And they had the little what are they? I don't know what they call it.
The head.
Yeah, they had the there's a
the nitrogen capsule. That's
they have a
and so when you poured it, it had the cream and the mixture and then the separating with the head and the flavors.
Yeah,
so
it was good.
Thank you, Mike, for contributing the Guinness Zero.
All right.
So in the meantime, we've been really talking about Cajetan and Luther and this idea of two guys in a room in Augsburg trying to sort it out. And really, Cajetan is kind of stuck trying to advocate for power. And Cajetan is really trying to kind of navigate, what does this look like to forgive sins? And Luther doesn't have to figure it out. He's already figured it out. It's the work of Christ, and it's received by faith. And the job of the church is to tell people about Jesus.
So now we look at it from Frederick's perspective. Let's take a step back and look from Frederick's perspective.
So he's following what's going on in Augsburg.
Very, very closely. And now what's interesting about Frederick is Frederick not only has, official lines of communication to what's happening with Cajetan and with in Augsburg and everything that's going on. Frederick also has friends who are there, and then he has spies who are there. Frederick is one of the most well-connected princes in all of Europe, and he has spies everywhere. And so he's getting information that the Pope doesn't want him to know, and he knows that the Pope is in a very weak position on this.
There's a reason ultimately why Cajetan could not just simply arrest Luther at Augsburg and lock him away. When Luther is meeting with his lawyers and trying to figure out on day 3, 4, and 5 what's next. There's a worry that he's about to get seized. That's why he leaves through the crack in the wall. But Frederick knows the Pope isn't as powerful in this position.
Right. So the Pope only had himself and the Dominicans were on his side.
And Luther, by background, is an Augustinian, which happens to be the order of our newest Pope, not our newest Pope.
Leo the 16th, I think.
Yeah.
It is.
Not
our Leo. Yeah, but yeah. So you have an Augustinian. Luther is an Augustinian, but all the other, the Miriams, there's all these different,
the Benedictines,
Carthusians, everybody else. They're all on Luther's
kind of
side.
watching.
Well, but they're either not they're watching or they're on Luther's side. Again, I can't overstate the importance of Luther's theology during this period and how that plays out with the politics.
Lutherans aren't, I think, generally very aware of, say, Roman Catholic tribes today, of the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, the Benedictines, the Western Rite, the Eastern Rite. I mean, for Lutherans, generally, you see a Roman Catholic church, you drive by, they're all the same. Within your time growing up, did you remember hearing distinctions between Jesuits and Dominicans?
Yeah. When I grew up, I went to Catholic schools, and so I went to I think it was a Mariam school, but I had my uncle went to a Jesuit school. And we knew that he was the Jesuits of that era the Jesuits were actually created to fight against the Lutherans. That was part, the Jesuits were part of the Counter-Reformation. And so in the pre-Vatican II Jesuits they were like very theologically, they were tough. And they had a reputation as being tough within the Catholic Church, that you didn't want to be dealing with the Jesuits. So I was aware of some of the different factions. Yeah.
Now, there's not Jesuits during Luther's time.
No,
but the boogeyman is a little bit like the Dominicans.
Yes,
they've got some of the Inquisition powers and some of that effort to be right.
That's right. And when we hear about Catholic abuses of that era, we should always keep in the back of our mind that the Catholic Church is nowhere near homogeneous during this era. Just because...
And it's not homogeneous today either.
It's not homogeneous today. But the abuses might have been happening with the Dominicans, but nothing might... the Augustinians might have been speaking out against it even in that same era. So it's have to sort of keep all of that in mind.
So we've got Dominicans. Later, Luther's going to write more disruptive papers and really kind of highlight some of these things. John Eck is going to come from that Dominican side of things. There's also, outside of the Dominicans, you've got the humanists, which I referenced before our beer break, with Erasmus, and kind of this... The humanists are not atheists. I think today people think of kind of theologians versus humanists. The humanists more were like, let's see what the text says.
Yeah, the humanists of this era were, I would say, very faithful. They and the Reformation grew out of humanism.
Because humanists were the ones that really developed good Greek manuscripts and made sure that theological debate was happening based on the Greek text and the Hebrew text and not just the Vulgate. Then you have the Augustinians. The Augustinians generally are in support of Luther. Luther himself coming from the Augustinian order. Frederick receives Cajetan's report. So going back to Frederick and Luther are leaving Augsburg, and Cajetan has left Augsburg, and now they're trying to figure out, what are people going to say about what happened at Augsburg?
So you have Cajetan. He goes back to the Pope. He writes his report to the Pope on what went down. It's very harsh. Frederick gets a copy of this, and he expects it to be harsh because he's got his spies everywhere. He knows what happened. But he sees that there's still a lot of room for him to maneuver, because he's not just looking at it from a theological standpoint, somewhat, but he is always careful to say he doesn't understand the theology.
Yeah.
But more so, he's looking at it from a political standpoint. And when Frederick looks at the politics, he knows that the Pope is weak.
So the wedge of time that Frederick is going to build is that Cajetan's report doesn't really include Luther's response. And so now Cajetan argues that Luther should be extradited to Rome, and Frederick the Wise says, hold on, we can't quite do that yet because Luther needs to be able to give a chance to write a response. And so this becomes the stretch of time, is that Cajetan writes a report which he thinks is really the final word of things. It's time to arrest Luther. It's time to send Luther to Rome. It's time to get him out of Germany. And Frederick says, you can't take him out of Germany yet because he hasn't had a chance to write his response in Germany to what you've accused him of.
So the Pope gets frustrated with all of this. He's tired of dealing with the whole Luther thing, and he decides he's going to come after Frederick, after Luther, and he decides to take a two-prong approach. The first thing he's going to do is offer Frederick the quote-unquote golden rose. And the golden rose is a gift that comes from the Pope to the most faithful of believers.
The Pope's going to do the good guy, bad guy.
He's going to try to play both sides.
This is the two-prong attack. So the good guy is, I'm going to give you this golden rose because you are one of the most faithful of Rome's subjects.
Right. And the bad guy thing is, and by the way, I'm sending a German to come to Luther and interview him and actually bring him back to me.
And the reason this German, Karl von Militz, is going to come is he's just delivering the rose. But while he's delivering the rose, I'm going to have him ask some more questions of Luther.
So
we had a whole episode on Karl von Militz, and by what a clumsy guy he is.
He is. He's never had these kinds of responsibilities before, and it sort of goes to his head. And he thinks, so he's got a lot of connections within Saxony.
Both ducal and electoral Saxony. He's got these family members. He's got the connections. He thinks that he's going to walk in and parade in, and everyone's going to bow to him because not only is he got this golden rose, he's representing the Pope.
The mistake Militz makes is he believes that because the Pope's on his side, he can just walk in and do this. What the Pope and what Frederick was afraid of was that Militz would go around to all of his support, all of his family, all of his relatives, and build a group of people who would stand against Frederick within Germany.
So von Militz, as he's traveling with the golden rose,
he just goes straight to Frederick.
On his way to Wittenberg, Militz stopped at the estate of Degenhardt Pfeffinger.
Oh, right.
And while he's there, he, in his drinking of wine, gets some loose lips. And he starts to brag about the letters he has from the Pope that gives him authorization to take Luther back with him to Rome. Von Militz was supposed to be the one who delivers the rose, and Frederick the Wise is going to welcome him. There's going to be this presentation of the rose, and that's really going to be it. The secondary responsibility of von Militz to bring Luther back is something von Militz wasn't supposed to really tell people about until he got there.
Right.
It's going to be this aha moment.
But Frederick knew it was coming.
Frederick knew it's coming. And so Frederick heard this from Pfeffinger and immediately changed his mind and about how welcoming he's going to be to von Militz.
So what was interesting was prior to the meeting with Pfeffinger, right? Prior to Militz basically spilling the beans to Pfeffinger, Frederick knew Militz was coming. Frederick was terrified. He started telling Luther, listen, you got to be ready to go. You got to be ready to leave and
So
hide.
Frederick knew a little bit that von Militz had not just the golden rose, but had some power.
Right. He knew that this was coming because of his spies. And he was terrified of what was going down. With the meeting with Pfeffinger, you have all of a sudden Frederick recognizes this guy isn't serious, that he's not really a political player. He goes in there, he's talking big, and Frederick interprets that as, you don't know what you're doing.
So von Militz, as he's talking big, he thinks he's rallying support through Saxony as he gets closer and closer to Wittenberg, that he's going to be marching towards Wittenberg, and all of these people are going to be following him. So von Militz imagines that his braggadocious way is building a following. But in fact, it does the opposite.
Frederick understands Saxony better than von Militz, who spent all of his time in Rome recently. And instead of it being, this big crowd behind him, Frederick realizes that it's going to be just Militz with this stupid rose.
And Militz starts to get unnerved because as he moves through Saxony, getting closer to Wittenberg, he starts to finally listen, and he realizes that Luther has support throughout Saxony. So in early December, just a couple weeks before they meet with Militz, Frederick sent a letter to Cardinal Cajetan. It's Frederick's only official letter ever outlining his thoughts on Luther, and he makes several points.
The first one is that he says Cajetan did not demonstrate sufficient cause for Luther to revoke his position.
And there's many learned men at universities that are agreeing with Luther.
It's possible that jealousy, Frederick actually said this, that it's possible that jealousy, and he doesn't name the Pope, I don't think, but he sort of implies that the Pope is jealous, or the papal position is due to jealousy about Luther. And that this has nothing to do with theology. It's just jealousy.
So people aren't listening to Luther. Some people are, like the universities, and those who are listening to Luther probably aren't hearing Luther because they're kind of blinded by the red mist of jealousy. And so he says the Roman Curia should consider Luther's offer of a debate, and he should be given an opportunity to show that he's not a heretic. And whatever debate happens, he should not be condemned in advance of that debate.
So all this is happening. Militz finally shows up and gets his meeting with Frederick.
A few days after Christmas.
A couple of days after Christmas.
In 1518.
And Militz, he starts out by trying to bully Frederick.
Showing this pile of letters that Militz has from the Pope. Like, I've got this letter, I've got this letter, I've got this letter. Look at all of the letters I have that show the Pope is behind me.
And Frederick just says, no, I don't care. And Militz didn't have anything.
He wasn't prepared for Frederick to essentially refuse. He thought that the powers that were displayed would be the powers that proved true. So Militz quickly backs off, offers to try to work with Frederick to patch things up between Luther and the Pope. And Frederick agrees.
Yeah.
So this is a moment that the Pope wasn't ready for. Militz says, let's patch things up. The Pope is trying to move everything towards extradition. And now Militz has just created more time. Because he says, yes, you're right. Let's try to patch things up.
Right. So Frederick sees the opportunity. He says, oh, yeah, let's bring Luther in. And Luther and Militz can talk. Yeah.
Militz was supposed to be there to silence the conversation, and instead he creates an invitation for even more conversation. 1518 ends. The Militz affair is pretty much closed. Luther did meet with Militz to craft a letter to patch things up with the Pope.
Frederick, once Luther and Militz were talking, Frederick got out of town. Mm-hmm. This was all happening in Altenburg, and so he left Altenburg and made himself unavailable to Militz after that.
So now Militz doesn't really have emperor, pope, anybody to talk to. It's just him in a room with Luther. Luther convinces Militz to drop the criticism of the papal, drop Luther's criticism of the papal position, and thinking if you stop criticizing the Pope, then the Pope will stop criticizing you.
That's what they came up with.
And Luther agreed to have an archbishop act as a judge of his writings as long as he would not have to be revoked in his arguments. The von Militz affair is this really fascinating, clumsy thing where von Militz was supposed to come and silence the moment, and Frederick the Wise knows how to utilize the moment to create even more time. Frederick the Wise realizes one of the greatest strengths of political power is to create time. If you can create time, then you can create opportunity for people to hear the truth. As soon as the Pope tries to eliminate the time, the Pope is trying to eliminate the number of people who hear Luther. Frederick says, let's keep Luther talking, and if we can keep Luther talking, then we keep reducing the Pope's power.
And that's where we end. So everybody's happy except the Pope. Until next time, cheers.